We're now going to concern ourselves with data collection and more specifically with observation. Observation involves recording the behavioural patterns of people, objects and events in a systematic manner. In fact, observation is a primary source of data. It's making direct observations. It's looking at events directly, an observer looking at the event and recording systematically and honestly what is being seen. Observation methods may be, they could be structured or they could be unstructured. Structured in the sense that they are set up and organized in advance, or unstructured, perhaps just as the event happens, observed in a very natural context, the context in which the event happens. They could be disguised or undisguised. The observer may be open about his or her presence as an observer, or the observer may pretend to be a part of the group or pretend to be someone else, just blending into the background, making the observations. So the observations could be disguised or undisguised. They may be natural or contrived. Natural in the sense that the observations are simply based on what happens. So the observer goes to the place where the event is to happen and makes the observations. Or they could be contrived. They could be set up. It could be set up in a different setting, and the group, if it's a group observation, the group could be asked to operate in a different environment or under different conditions. That's a contrived observation. Natural is what I think interests most people, most observers, to try and find out what is the outcome in the natural setting. It can be personal. They could be looking at people. They could be looking at one-to-one. They could be observing one person, or it could be observing a group. It could be related to issues around group work, for example, in a company. People are extremely complex, and this type of approach to research is very flexible, and it enables some feedback, some comments to come back from the observer that will put all of the observations perhaps in context. But people are complex, and observations are a good tool to look at that complexity. Of course, it could be mechanical. It could be observations based on looking at some production system, looking at the performance of machinery under certain conditions, making observations about the performance of the machinery, what are its stress levels, how does it perform under different conditions. So it could be that the observations are not based on people, based on machines or on some form of technology instead. So that could be, I should say, mechanical or electrical. It could be non-participant. Non-participant means the observer stays outside of the group, if it's a group that's been observed. The observer stays outside and makes observations as an outsider looking in. They are not participating in the group. They're not involved in the group. They are observing the group as an outsider. Of course, the opposite of that is they could be participants. So the participant could be involved in the group and take a role in the group and make observations from within. The danger with that, of course, is that the observer then influences the group, influences the outcome. So the outcome is not very realistic. It's not perhaps what would happen in a natural setting. So there are downsides to that. Now let's look at structured or unstructured. Structured observation. Well, the researcher specifies in detail what is to be observed and how the measurements should be recorded. This is for a structured observation. The observer specifies how the measurements will be taken and how they are to be recorded. This is best used when the problem is clearly defined and the information needed is clearly specified. So structured is good when there's clarity in what is required. When the purpose of the exercise is to get a clear picture, and when clear measurements can be taken, then a structured approach is best. For unstructured, well, in this case, the researcher observes all aspects of the phenomenon that seem relevant. This is usually used when the problem is not very clear. It gives more flexibility, and there is the possibility of more bias in this approach. Unstructured, it's when the phenomenon is not very clear. The issue is not very clear. So that the observer makes the most of what's there, of what is to be seen, and makes as much, or tries to glean as much information as possible out of the situation. But because it's unclear, there isn't an opportunity, if that's the right word, for bias to be entered into the results. So bias is something that is not desirable. Bias is to be avoided because bias gives a false picture. Now, the disguised or undisguised, as I mentioned earlier. Well, the respondents for a disguised one are unaware that they are being observed, and therefore to behave naturally. For example, the secret shopper. The secret shopper who goes into the shop and observes what's going on in the shop and observes the process of the shop and the service of the shop. But no one knows who the secret shopper is. The idea here is to get a true picture of the outcome. Natural or contrived. Well, natural observations, this involves observing a phenomenon as it takes place in the environment. Simply the natural phenomenon as it happens. The contrived observation, the respondent's behaviour is observed in an artificial environment, for example in a laboratory or under some staged setting. So in a contrived situation, the observations are made with some constraints. They're not natural. If it's a group observation, the group may be asked to go to a meeting room and discuss the issue. The fact that they have moved their environment means it's contrived. Perhaps they should have been asked in situ, where they normally work. That would have been better. So there are issues here about natural or contrived environments. Now the personal one. Well, personal observation, this approach, the researcher observes the actual behaviour as it occurs. The observer may or may not normally attempt to control or manipulate the phenomenon being observed. The observer simply records what takes place. Now the mechanical. It is possible to use closed-circuit television to make observations. Now this is the use of mechanical equipment to make observations of people or of events. It's possible that the internet or CCTV or some sort of device could be used to help collect data about a group. So observations could be based on that. There is also the issue that I said right at the start, that observations can be used on mechanical equipment itself to see how it's performing under various levels of production, let's say. So there is a role for technology and for electrical and mechanical tools in the observation process. The non-participant, well, the observer does not normally question or communicate with the people being observed. So the non-participant means the observer stays remote from the group, observes the group, but does not get involved in any way, does not communicate with the group. For the participant, in this approach, the researcher becomes or is part of the group that is being investigated. So for participant observation, the observer becomes a part of the group and works within the group. This is widely used in sociology and anthropology, and it's also been increasingly used in business. For example, managers working on the shop floor or in the market. So the managers may go onto the shop floor to get experience of what's happening on the shop floor. So they're working on the shop floor and observing issues on the shop floor. So it's participant observation. Now the researcher as an employee. Well, in this approach, the researcher works within an organization alongside other employees, effectively as one of them. So in this case, the researcher takes the role of an employee and works with the other employees. This is useful when management needs first-hand information about the work processes. When management needs to know exactly what's happening on the shop floor in a certain work process, they may have a researcher who becomes a worker, so that the researcher gets first-hand experience of the process. There are some issues with this, of course. The researcher's presence may be compromised, especially in the long run. When someone joins the workforce as an employee, eventually they become friends with the other ones and their position can be exposed. There may be inconsistencies in their stories. And once it's compromised, then management may have an even bigger problem on their hands. The workforce may totally mistrust the management. Now, of course, there are ethical considerations to be taken into account here. This is false. Somebody joining the workforce, a researcher joining the workforce to make observations, there are ethical issues. They're spying in many respects on the other workers, and the other workers are unaware of their true function. And their true function is not to get the job done like the others, but the true function is to report back to the management about issues. So there are ethical considerations here. Now the researcher as an explicit role. Well, the researcher is present every day over a period of time, but entry is negotiated in advance with management and preferably with employees as well. Now, this is the opposite of the researcher as an employee. This is the researcher with an explicit role. The management need information, first-hand information about what's happening on the shop floor. So they tell the workforce or ask the workforce to cooperate with someone who will work with them, but whose true function is to make observations. Now this has been upfront, this has been open with the workers. The individual is quite clear in the role of the researcher, who can move round, observe, interview and participate in the work as appropriate. So it's a very open approach to data collection. This type of role is most favoured as it provides many of the insights that the complete observer would gain, whilst offering much greater flexibility without the ethical problems that deception entails. So no one has been fooled. The workers know who the person is who's making the observations. There is no deception. Now, interrupted involvement. Well, the researcher is present sporadically over a period of time. For example, moving in and out of the organization to deal with other work or to conduct interviews with or observations of different people across a number of different organizations. So simply, there is a researcher who moves between organizations and who may be in one organization for a proportion of the week and in a different organization for the rest of the week. So it's coming and going. It's a researcher who moves between them. But this has got some advantages, because the workforce become accustomed to this person coming and going, and they just see it as perhaps a more relaxed form of data collection. It's obviously not very important, or the person would stay all the time and collect the data, so they feel more relaxed, and in that sense maybe more open and more honest about the processes. This approach very rarely involves much participation in the work. Now, observation alone. Well, the observer, I should say, role is often disliked by employees since it appears to be eavesdropping. So often the observer is resented in the workplace. The inevitable detachment prevents the degree of trust and friendship forming between the researcher and respondent, which is an important component in other methods. So having someone that comes and goes may lead to a detachment. They're not forming relationships with the workers, and therefore contaminating the data that's been collected. The data is perhaps more accurately collected in that way, but observers are often resented in the workplace. They're seen as eavesdropping and prying, and workers, generally speaking, may resent that. Now, the choice of roles. Well, the role adopted depends on the following. The purpose of the research. Does the research require continued longitudinal involvement? Longitudinal means long period of time. Longitudinal, a very long period of time. So does the research require continued longitudinal involvement, or will in-depth interviews, for example, conducted over time, give the type of insight required? So does the researcher require continual involvement, or will in-depth interviews conducted from time to time, would they not be a better source of information? Does it have to be observation? The cost of the research. Well, to what extent can the researcher afford to be committed for extended periods of time? Are there additional costs such as training? Using an observer is an expensive way of collecting information, or collecting data, I should say. It may be that other forms of data collection may be more appropriate. So the use of an observer must be carefully thought out in advance. Is it the most appropriate way? Is it perhaps the only way that the data can be collected? Now, the extent to which access can be gained. Well, gaining access where the role of the researcher is either explicit or covert can be difficult and may take time. Not all groups want to be observed. Groups may resent it. And if they resent it, then getting the observer in and getting the workers to work naturally may be a real issue. There may be real problems there. And the extent to which the researcher would be comfortable in the role. If the researcher intends to keep his or her identity concealed, will he or she also feel able to develop the type of trusting relationships that are important? I mean, if the observer is undercover, concealed or disguised, if the observer is disguised, let's say, perhaps he or she will not feel comfortable in that position. They feel that the information that they're collecting is collected under some sort of false pretense. They are prying into the lives of other people and are doing it secretively. It doesn't sound right. It sounds like there are ethical issues involved with that. So there are ethical issues that need to be addressed. Now, the amount of time the researcher has at his or her disposal. Well, some methods involve a considerable amount of time. If time is a problem, alternative approaches have to be sought. So it's not a cheap and easy way of collecting data. It may be most appropriate in some cases, as we discussed earlier, but in other cases it may be too expensive, or there may be too many other issues, such as resentment by the group, as I've just said. So it may not be universally the best method of collecting data. There may be scope for the other methods, questionnaires, in-depth interviews, focus groups. There may be all sorts of other ways of collecting the information. In this class we've covered quite a few points, quite a detailed class. I suggest strongly that you go back over the video, play it again, stop it from time to time, make your own notes, and try to do some research online into the issues that are raised here. You'll find a wealth of information on this online. There are many excellent sites that discuss these issues, and you'll find a lot of information there. So just go to Google, type in your research question, what you want answered, and you will perhaps be pleasantly surprised at the amount of information that there is. But for the moment, that's all I want to say, so thank you for watching.